to our basics of HTML course. Within this course, I'm going to be running through some of the most basic pieces of HTML and how to actually use it to create web content and how everything works together. So the first thing that I want to talk about are tools. So in order to create files, you need to have some kind of tools. If you're on a Windows machine or if you have Word, you can always save your Word documents as HTML. And what this does is this allows a browser to interpret that file as an HTML file and read through the content and output that content within the browser. Now, a browser doesn't need to be live on a web server in order to render out HTML content. So over here, I have this file. It's open in Notepad. It's a completely blank file. And notice that I've given it the extension HTML and I've called it index. Now, the reason that we start out with index or default is that these are the default files that the server will look for as a default for that path. So when we look at our path right now, because we're going to the direct path of the file, we're actually seeing that whole file directory. But if we go over to on a server machine and if we go to that same file, if we do index.html or if we leave out that index.html, regardless, it will render that out as the first page within that file structure. So now I'm going to actually add a little bit of content onto the page, and I'm going to be using a tool called Notepad. So Notepad is a free downloadable editor that you can download and use on your machine. So you can use any editor, any file creation software. So anything from TextPad to Notepad and even some of the more complex editors. Anyone can create HTML files. So you have a lot of options when you are creating actual HTML files. So if you don't have an editor that you're using on a regular basis or you're comfortable with, I would suggest to start with Notepad because it does allow you to structure HTML code. And the first thing I'm going to write out is hello world and save it. So now when I go over to the file, I see that the browser renders that out as hello world. So it just simply renders it out as text within the browser. And when I go to the server version, and again, I'm going to remove that index.html, we see that it renders that out as well. So either way, the browser is the one that's actually rendering out that HTML. And you're probably looking at this and saying, well, this doesn't really look like any kind of specific HTML code that I've seen. Usually you've got all these closing and opening tags and a whole bunch more syntax available. And that's the correct way of writing out HTML, but the browsers are smart enough in order to understand and render out the content as text content within the browser. So even though you don't have the headings, you don't have the body, you don't have the proper HTML file structure, it's still smart enough to render this out. But when it comes to format, this isn't exactly the best way to do format within HTML. So if you were just to write out a bunch of text, even though it would show up within the browser, this isn't the proper approach to creating your HTML content within your browser. And one other thing that I did want to note here is that when you are saving the file, make sure that you do save it as a .html extension. So some of these editors will by default try to save it as a text file if it's not specified. So always make sure that you go to all files and save it as an HTML. And then when you're ready actually to see how it's going to look within the browser, you can always go over to here and launch the file within the browser. So this shows us that index file that we just created, so it's the same path that we have over here and being rendered out by the browser. So in the next lesson, we're going to start looking at deeper into what we can do with HTML, start getting started with actual tagging of HTML and setting up the structure of that HTML file.